it's time to kick off. We're going to talk about quantification of cyber risk. So, a show of hands, who knows the answer to that question? Yeah? Okay. So, as we put our heads together a little bit here before we started, we believe that this is something that's been, they've been trying to get a handle on this question since the very beginning, and it's extremely difficult. However, the more data that comes in, the closer we can approximate to the truth. So, as is the case in many fields of endeavor. So, I want to just go down the row here and have everyone, not only introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, what your background is, and what you're doing now.
Thanks, Harold. I'm Jack Freund. I've been working in technology for 20 years, beginning at Lucent Technologies, doing telecommunications engineering. The past 12 years have been exclusively focused on risk management and especially cyber risk quantification. I'm the co-author of the standard and book on cyber risk quantification, widely regarded to be industry standard, called the Factor Analysis of Information Risk, or FAIR. Larry mentioned that in his presentation. And I finished a 7-year stint at TIAA-CREF Financial Services, top 70 company implementing a cyber risk quantification program there. And I'm now at RiskLens, a commercial software developer that creates cyber risk quantification tools, and technical advisor to the FAIR Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the open source FAIR standard.
Howdy, I'm George Finney. I'm the CISO for Southern Methodist University here in Dallas. I've been at SMU for 16 years. I got my law degree from SMU, so go Mustangs. It's nice to have a good football team again after 35 years. I do both cyber as well as physical security, so I'm kind of concerned not just with cyber risk, but a little broader than that. I've also written a couple of books on cybersecurity. No more magic wands. My passion is really trying to get cybersecurity to the layperson, right? I think our audience is typically the cybersecurity professional, but I'm a little worried that we're kind of creating an echo chamber. It's awesome to see the diversity here in this group, and I think we need to broaden our audience as much as we can to help continue improving cyber.
Good morning. My name is Pete Goldman. I'm the Enterprise Risk Officer for the Cyber Vertical for the U.S. Department of State. All opinions expressed are my own, because I have a lawyer next to me. And I've been at this specifically working with risk since approximately 2003, when I was a party to too many conversations that ended with an auditor, an IT auditor, presenting a result and weaknesses to leadership, who would then say, so what? What does this mean? What should I do? What am I supposed to take this with, And it became very apparent that there was a need to represent the technical exposures, which I was very accustomed to because I've worked in technology the better part of my career, but to translate those and make those worthwhile for people that are worried about getting a mission accomplished or a business generated, to say, okay, I'm going to do something about this because I don't like the prospect of possibly failing based upon what you're telling me. And I have been hunting the elusive risk quantification. We're going to have a really cool panel because I'm not a subscriber to FAIR. And I want to delve into that sort of quantification, semi-quantification, and qualified assessment results a bit more with you all. And I agree with the echo chamber concept completely, because I often find myself speaking to cyber professionals, and I much prefer speaking to the main risk areas of accounting or finance, or anyone that's dealing with ongoing business activities that needs to understand better this very abstract world of cyber.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, David. Thank you, Val. Wonderful panel. My name is Nag. I'm coming from the East Coast, New Jersey and New York. In the last 25 years, I am working mostly on the banking and financial services. And I specialize in the banking regulatory framework, especially in the last 10 years during the financial crisis, working for global financial institutions on their board-level governance framework, design frameworks that helps the banks to overcome their culture, conduct, and the reputational area. I'm on the advisory board for a number of companies, and not but the least, I enjoy my publication work and research, and love to share the papers to the team and everybody. Thank you.
So one of the things that was just mentioned, George talked about both the physical and the cyber risk. So is anybody familiar with as-is, the security society, security organization? Just about 3 years ago, they had their very first cyber panel, and it was fairly well attended, but it was a real anomaly. 40,000 people show up to talk about physical risk, and I think they had about 1,200 people that were interested in the cyber risk. I went then the year after that, and there were probably 3,000 people in the room to hear some discussion about cyber risk. But we're talking about this conversion. So when you think of the history of risk, who do you think about? Who do you think about? Say again? Okay, he thinks about, when you think of the history of risk. History. Adam and Eve. I think of insurance companies. They've been in the business of risk for a long time. They've been trying to quantify risk for a long time in the physical, okay? But also in some of the unknowns like weather, correct? When they're sailing ships and so forth. So what I'd like to ask you each to weigh in on the convergence of the physical and the cyber, the risk versus the hazard, the why. I think Jyoti talked about the why. What is it that we're trying to protect?
I think there are a lot of really good practices in insurance industries that can be leveraged in cybersecurity. And in fact, that's a lot of what I did and my co-author did in creating FAIR was we pretend in cybersecurity as an industry that what we do is relatively unique and different from everything else. And I was recently having some conversations with friends at NIST about some standards and quantification standards aligning FAIR to the NIST CSF framework. And I was explaining what I was doing and how we approach this. We're using trusted actuarial methods that have been in existence for many, many decades to do this thing. He was relieved because he says so many people come to NIST with measurement ideas that are unique and different, and they don't really do a lot of the pre-work, like what's everybody else already doing to solve this, and how can we leverage existing knowledgeable people and concepts in this new space. So while it feels unique and different, and in a lot of ways it certainly is, the risk that it poses has been, and things like this have been measured again and again in the past. So it's beneficial to do a little bit of research first to figure out what other people are doing so that we can leverage those in our industry.
So how many folks have cyber risk insurance? So just a couple. How many folks have cyber risk insurance?
1, 2, 3.
A couple more, okay. So I'm lucky enough to fill out our cyber risk insurance application form every year. Any guesses on how long that form is? It's actually 4 pages. But the first page is all, how many employees does SMU have? So, there might be good actuarial methods, but in practice, that piece of paper is worthless. There's no way that they could assess our actual risk on cyber based on that form. They're writing, they're taking our checks. We've heard from other CISOs. I don't know that of any CISO that says I love my cyber risk insurance. I don't know that they're paying out on all policies. I don't know that we understand them and understand what they cover. So I think it's a challenge. I don't know that we've cracked that code, on the cyber risk side. On the physical risk side, I think there's a lot of fear around that, right? So, in higher ed, we're very concerned about active shooters. And, what the FBI will tell you is, it's over within 90 seconds. If one were to happen now in this room, what would you do? Where would you go? And I think, we will all in that instant be able to make the run, hide, fight choice. But I mean, in reality, well, it's probably less because we have a room full of police officers in the next room over. But I think someone earlier said, as human beings, we're really great at making risk-based decisions. When you drove here, right? Driving your car is inherently dangerous, right? You know what lane to be in, what speed to go. You see other people making dangerous decisions, and you'll try and probably get away from them. But we're bad at doing that in cyber, and I think part of why that might be the case is, the technology is so good, actually, that it obfuscates the problem, right? If we didn't, have anti-spam or anti-phishing technologies, people would see how bad email is, and they'd be a lot less likely to click, right? So I think it's, when we talk about risk, I think we need to have a conversation, and it really is about education and understanding the full scope of where you are and what you're doing.
You covered a number of points that I think I would probably also agree with. I spend a great deal of my time using real-world physical examples and analogies to help people understand the abstract nature of cyber risk, right? You're correct. We deal with risk every day. We decide on it almost on an hourly basis, if not more frequently. And we do so repetitively that we don't really think about it. We rely on our instinct and our experience, right? And our experiences are gained from what we can see, what we can hear, and what we can touch. For example, here's an experiential learning. How many people get into an elevator and assume it'll go where you intend it to go? When's the last time you thought about what would happen if it didn't? Right? You've been on the wrong elevators.
It was a DFW, and I got stranded in an elevator about 3 years ago.
It's
I
experiential.
still think about it.
It's experiential. And unfortunately, we learn most about risk after an undesired event occurs, right? And then we become risk averse as opposed to risk accepting. And the real answer is it's not supposed to drive us against risk. In order to continue to thrive and grow, we have to embrace risk. But what we're really talking about doing is embracing a knowledgeable risk, being aware of what the consequences would be, and choosing to still go forward. For example, if I was investing and I had 2 pencils and somebody told me if I gave them 2, they'd give me 10 back, I would make that investment every day. But if I said I have 2 and they said they'll give me 1 back for every 2 I give them, I would say, you're nuts, I'm not going to do that, right? And it's the same sort of situation that we have to evaluate each day. And so I think there's a great many lessons to be learned from the physical risk constructs that we deal with all the time. And the analogy I like to use is as executives, and I talked about this with Harold last night, you're riding horses with a blindfold, and you've not yet been handed the reins. And someone has to tell you where the reins are, and then someone has to tell you when you pull one side or the other, hard or not real hard, what happened, so that you know how to calibrate your adjustment. And in cyber, that's the problem, and it's compounded by the velocity of onset. Pretty much by the time you've been hit and realize you've been hit, you're probably done. You're doing mop-up work at that point, if you're lucky enough to stay in business. It's like being on a ship at sea and have a fire break out, but you never train anybody to fight the fire. By the time they learn how to do it, you're probably done. And that's the challenge and the struggle we face. And it's not surprising, and I know I'm talking on, so I'll stop here. It's not surprising that with the costs that are at stake and the amount of money that's being spent in this space, that there's a very strong desire to reduce that spend and make it more targeted for effectiveness. And this is where I throw you a kudo. I think the FAIR model does a good job of focusing that attention and getting people to say, you know what, that's an inconsequential thing. We've thought about that, so let's not worry about it. But this one is a consequential thing, and we'll put time on that.
See, in my view, cyber evolved in the last 3 years or 4 years. Prior to that, I'm talking about before 2008 financial crisis, everybody has experienced managing large global programs as a program managers or leading the program with multi-million dollars. So So there is a method to madness. You perform those program management successfully, whether you do the program assessment and identifying what the areas of opportunity for growth, but the risk was always the least important factor because you always look for the growth as an opportunity. After the financial crisis, everybody was started looking towards the risk, but that's predominantly about the regulatory risk. But again, it was not a cyber risk. I believe probably Sony was the first major cyber threat that happened, and everybody started realizing that they need to protect their data. So to that extent, not a financial model has been developed on the cyber risk so far. Maybe one is a fair, and I would say we actually published a paper on the regression model based on the available data, but it's an evolving trend. So quantifying your cyber risk, I think it's still at an early phase in our conversation, but there's a lot needs to be done there.
Okay, so let's work back down. I'm going to ask a very simple question. Why in the world would I want to quantify cyber risk? Why?
Because that's the business threat we are facing currently. It is the existence of your business, and if it's not a reactive response anymore, it is a proactive approach at the board level, as the previous speaker has mentioned. Cyber risk is not a compliance checkbox anymore to begin with. It need to be addressed proactively at the board level, and the leadership team has to step in and start talking about it. So that's my approach.
Okay, so Peter, why do we want to quantify risk?
Because bad things can happen. Yeah, illuminate that, right? So
Meteors can hit us.
there are a lot of situations that call upon businesses to spend money for a number of different reasons to avoid bad things happening, even reputationally, right? There's a lot of, well, I don't want to be in front, but I don't want to be at the back of the pack either, right? So I want to be in the mix of what people are doing because that's the safe space to be in. And one of the challenges we're faced with is, since there is not a legally defined level of due care in cyber, being diligent is elusive. I always say it's back to the Clint Eastwood statement, how lucky do you feel today? And that can cause a great deal of spend to occur in cyber and frankly, materially affect the bottom line of a company's ability to thrive and grow. And so there's this innate desire to get your arms wrapped around the problem and do what you need to do, but not more than you need to do. And without some means of quantifying what that is, in my world it's semi-quantified because there's some scenario-based analyses that go with it. You have to have a sense ordinally for what's bigger than something else, right? I don't have to know the exact number. I don't have to know there's a 95% risk, but I have to know that that risk is 2 or 3 times bigger than this risk, so that I can make prioritization decisions on where to spend money and where to say, I think I can defend that one to the regulators or to the public writ large.
So it's a risk-return analysis.
Yes.
George?
So Harold, I love that question. The panelist last time said, you know, start with why, right? I'm a huge proponent of Simon Sinek. So let's start with why. I'm going to change my title to Chief Dream Protection Officer because I love that, right? That's why. So you know, when we got the Bush Library, we kicked off a number of projects on the cyber as well as physical side to improve security at the campus. We probably spent $10 million over the course of a couple years. Everybody's concerned about active shooters, and absolutely, we want to be able to shift from, you know, being reactive to be able to prevent those. But really, at the end of the day, it's about, you know, protecting our students, right? You know, and you know, other companies have customers, and maybe you never see them, but to know those folks are going to be on campus, and you know, I mean, we see them every day. To see them, you know, grow. Or our motto is "World Changers Shaped Here." Right, we want to be a part of that, and you know, as a security professional, that's why. So you know, did we start with a complicated risk model and try and quantify all of the risks and provide ROI back to we wanted to, no, we didn't do that. We didn't say, here's our roadmap and here's what we think is going to happen. But at the back end of that, I can say over the 3-year period when we started those projects, we reduced crime on campus by over 60%. So, I mean, there was an impact, and it wasn't the active shooter, right? The once in a in a decade kind of thing that other universities have faced. I mean, how do you measure the loss of life there? You can't. But to know that we've impacted students in a positive way, whether it's sexual assault or burglaries or that we protect their dreams, right? We help them grow, and hopefully we're helping educate them along the way to become better digital citizens.
In December of this year, past year, I wrote an article for the ICC Journal called "The Future of Cyber Quantification," and in it I talked about 3 things that I think are relevant to the answer to your question, Harold. That is, I think the first is what I'll just sort of loosely call when everything's important, nothing's important. So even if you have a giant list of top risks, and a lot of organizations maintain these kind of registers, these are my top 10 things. The top 5 are red, the bottom 5 are yellow or orange or whatever color you want to use. When all 5 things are important, there's no priority amongst them. Even if you ordinally scale them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is the 4th thing, 4 times as important as the first thing. You don't know, there's no unit of measure there. So cyber quantification really helps you understand what amount of loss your organization could face if they experience one of those things. And not to be callous, but in the insurance industry and the government, largely, we've been measuring loss of life for centuries. We've been doing this forever. It's a thing that's widely done. A lot of state agencies, EPA maintains a value they call the value of a statistical life that they use in their planning. And this just sort of connotes, not that life is fungible in that way, but the other part of it is that if you don't value it appropriately, it's difficult to weigh it against other priorities that an organization may have. So I think that's one thing that really helps you to do. The second thing is, in financial services, they maintain something they call capital reserve allocations. We all do this. We call it a savings account, right? It's the money you stash away for a rainy day. So financial services companies have to do this, and largely every company should probably have a rainy day fund. That's a reasonable thing to do. How much of that you should put away to cover potential losses you may experience from cyber exposures is an important thing. Every dollar you spend in that savings account is a dollar you're not investing in your business somewhere. So you have to sort of prioritize and have an analytical way of doing that. Georgia said something I'm going to disagree with in our opening statement. She said we all do risk analysis well every day. I don't think we do. Kahneman talks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, what he calls System 1 and System 2 thinking, which is an economics professor point of view. I like one of my children's psychologists who calls it upstairs and downstairs thinking, because that's how you have to dumb things down for children. It's, are we thinking with our lizard brain, a sort of quick, reactive kind of thing, this looks dangerous, I'm walking the other direction? Or do we spend time analyzing things and thinking about what's the right approach and considering things and our own biases? I think that's an important consideration too, is spending time doing that allows you to more accurately allocate resources in places that they need to be. No matter what organization you work for, it does not have an unlimited amount of resources, people, time, money, to spend on information security. So we have to spend time justifying why that is and what are the right things to spend on. The third thing is, I think a lot of companies are thinking about cyber insurance. I think it's an important thing, even if you are not investing in a cyber insurance policy. There are some benefits to running that type of analysis. If I spent $1 million on premium, I would get a certain amount of protection. What if I invested that $1 million in my own information security program instead? Or what if instead of, I've been in situations where a lot of suppliers are not keeping insurance policies unless their customers are asking them to do that. Or they're supposed to put a bond up to cover the potential losses that they may incur. Again, how much you put in there and how much you invest in that versus your own program, that's a difficult question that requires System 2, some thoughtful analysis to be accurate in that.
So hard to argue with Daniel Kahneman, but I will say in my own experience, the ultimate goal, right, going back to why, isn't to come up with a mathematical model. It's really about prioritization, where you're going to invest your money, and in my experience, those priorities, are almost self-evident. right? If you know that you don't have, cameras, you can't detect things, you can't respond. If you know you don't have firewalls or antivirus, right? Those are table stakes, right? So I think, there are only so many cybersecurity controls, and if, how do those fit into your strategy, and how do you, how do you prioritize? Well, I think it's about knowing yourself, knowing your values, knowing where you're at, and I think, if you want to get really granular with all your controls, sure, but I think ultimately, if your strategy is to drive towards being proactive rather than reactive, I think you can lay out a roadmap that that doesn't necessarily have to reflect with a calculated algorithm on what your risks are going to be.
Yeah, I think this is a common model that a lot of people put in place in their cyber risk management programs, which is, I'm just going to hire somebody really smart and they're going to pick the right things, and they know these right things because they've been doing it forever. I think that one of the big fallacies of cyber risk quantification is that it requires granular thinking. I think if you're doing that, I think it's broken. I think it needs to be very high-level, ERM-level conversations around loss scenarios and not necessarily control-by-control basis. But I left along with Edna, and she joked earlier that there's a NIST catalog with 2,000 controls. Which one do you pick? That's insane. You can't do them all. It's like Pokemon. You're not going to collect them all. I've been playing for years. You're not going to get all those Pokemon. I already know this.
Come to campus. We've got a lot of gyms on.
There you go. But I think one of the things that I'm really impressed with is the CISO at Highmark Health in Pittsburgh, Omar. He has implemented something of his staff, which is he asks them every year to remove a control from their environment. It's a very revolutionary thing for cybersecurity departments to think about. Like, how do we justify taking something out of place to better enable the business that's really just weighing them down? And there's a definite, thoughtful work that they do to make that happen. But you can't do that unless you have an analytical model to back that up. We don't have to spend money on this anymore. We can enable you to do the same things you're doing and then move on to the next thing and reinvest those resources elsewhere.
So let's apply this to a real world example again, right? This nation suffered a great loss around 9/11, and no one can argue that the way we conduct ourselves in society today in public places hasn't changed for each and every individual person, right? Before that, we were a lot more free about ourselves. We didn't consider the possibility of some random act touching us. I mean, we always used to say things like, hey, did you hear Joe's garage got broken as you're down the street? Man, poor Joe. Never thought about the fact that it could have been your garage. You just know it wasn't you, right? And so in the cyber context, I would say that the prevalence of these attacks, and I won't call them breaches because I think that implies something's taken, and that's not always the case. But these attacks are happening with such a repetitiveness that people are starting to move, the general populace is starting to move into an understanding that this thing is something that can happen and quite randomly could happen to me. And now I'm motivated to think my way through what I should do about that. And where I come from on quantification really is rooted in something like that. And I think we've been sort of touching around that here and there. If the consequence of something occurring, whatever it may be, becomes something so important to you that it alters fundamental things you believe in, whether it's your company's operation or your personal life, then you're going to take an action. If you believe that what could happen is something that is just sort of on the order of these things happen, and please, I'm not going to quote a source in this, but I was led to believe that after the Target breach, there wasn't a substantial investment in cybersecurity because there was a balancing conversation about this is just sort of the nature of being in retail business, and it's a risk we deal with. There are banking, for example, Jamie Dimon invested heavily because he's in the business of trust, and he couldn't lose that trust. So I think we need quantification to the extent that we can prioritize, to your point, George. But I think that being overly precise is an enemy to the process itself unless the consequence of the failure is so important that it wouldn't be acceptable.
So it's my understanding, it's my belief that the reason that we want to quantify risk is because we want to figure out a way to mitigate it, right? I mean, we want to do something about it. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical in a few minutes that we have here, and I want you to each respond to this hypothetical. And it's in the area of cyber insurance policy, okay? So I have a mid-size operation, a mid-size enterprise, and I go through all of the, the cyber hygiene, the resilience, get everything squared away, and the underwriter comes in, if there's an underwriter, and sells me a policy, okay? They assign their premium, and that's what I have. 10 months later, I suffer a breach. Nothing has changed. The parameters that were in place, the tools that were in place when that policy was written 10 months ago, nothing has changed. Have I exercised my level of care, my due care, my to warrant being paid out of that policy?
Well, I'm not an attorney, but I think you'd need to read your policy to know for sure. I mean, I know we're experiencing some of this debate. I know the Mondelez breach is sort of merging into the space, like, are they going to get paid or not going to get paid? I think that's one of the really important things that we need to think about as we get these policies underwritten, because they're not going to cover, by their very nature, all of the loss that you may experience. And that's one of the really important things that I think cyber quantification really helps you to understand more is, not just the direct costs associated with the breach, but a lot of those cascading costs associated with customer churn and things like that.
But am I responsible for the dynamic nature?
I think it's an evolving industry. What I can tell you is we've had conversations with a number of underwriters to work on this. And if you talk to actuaries about this exact problem, they don't need precision. I like to say, I had a good friend one time, he was a car collector, and he would just sort of buy all these fancy cars, and we went to dinner one time, and he parked far away, like that kind of thing. And I was like, oh yeah, it's a pain having to carry a car like this. He's like, actually, if somebody wrecked my car, I would make money on the deal, because he had a named value policy written through AIG. You just picked a value, they picked a premium based upon that value, and there you go. A lot of the cyber insurance policies are written at a very high level like this. So that form you filled out was not assessing your risk, it was assessing their risk about what's the likelihood of you experiencing loss in an educational environment with so many people. So that's where those things are focused on. It's much the same way that you making a driving error is your fault, but they still pay out. I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now, is they're trying to make sure that the exclusions are purposeful in the policies such that they don't take a bath. But the margin on those policies right now, from what I'm hearing clandestinely to a lot of people, are pretty phenomenal. So there's probably a lot of room in that market for those premiums to drop and be much more competitive.
They can afford to pay.
They can right now, yeah. At least that's what I understand.
So I want to say, from a technical perspective, if nothing has changed in your environment over 10 months, that means you haven't patched. So, you probably are, a little negligent. Is it gross, or is it? But I want to take the question from not a Fortune 500, I've got a team of 1,000 people to do cybersecurity. Most businesses in the United States are small businesses. You might have, if you're a nonprofit, if you have, 500 people, you're probably lucky to have, 2 or 3 IT people. You probably, even at that size, don't have a cybersecurity person. When you think about, whatever risk formula, it has to be, something that makes sense, not to an IT person, not to a cybersecurity person, but to anybody. I mean, a mom and pop grocery store that has 10 people, they're also at risk of getting breached. And, it would probably be awesome for them if they had a cyber risk policy, assuming they're online and they had some sort of presence like that. Or, well, gosh, they do payroll, and now my payroll database has been compromised with ransomware. How do I do payroll? Well, I mean, those issues are prescient, I mean, for every business. And, we've got to figure out a way of making sure that, mom and pop grocery stores can find a way to not be negligent, right? To not have to be like Alice in Wonderland and run just to stay in the same place.
I have a different take on the cyber insurance. Here's a classic scenario where a global insurance company underwrites a global bank's crown jewels for X millions of dollars. they cannot, the insurance company cannot hold the entire policy, so they'll underwrite multiple insurance companies. Then it goes as a couple of trenches down. So there's a possibility or a challenge. Oh, sorry. There's a challenge having the systemic risk or a concentration risk having part of the cyber risk area. So it's like creating a synthetic product out of your cyber insurance. That was been actually talked in one of the academia papers 4 years back before the cyber insurance term was coined. But coming back to cyber insurance, I see that most of the financial institutions are focused on cyber insurance aspect because they have the CISO nominated and he or she is actually working on it. That is for too big to fail financial institutions, but that's not across the industries I have seen. That's my observation. Thank you.
Peter, so you're the one that brought up the level of care, duty,
Yeah.
breach of duty.
So the good news is in federal government, we can't buy insurance. So we don't have to face this conundrum. But, you know, I think to your point, the first thing I heard when you said, I'm as I was when you wrote me the policy, why wouldn't you pay? Paraphrasing what you said, immediately fired off flags because cybersecurity is a journey without a destination. It's a continually changing environment in response to observed actions. And so if I had a company that I wrote a policy for and I went back a year later and they said we had a problem and nothing's changed here, and I'd say, well, why hasn't anything changed? There is some degree of, I think this goes to contributory negligence, right? In an insurance world, if you contribute to the possibility of harm, then I have an out on whether or not I have to either pay you partial or all of what you were insured for. Because it's an agreement that you're going to do your part to prevent the possibility to a reasonable level of me having to actually cover your losses, right? I'm here in the event that you have something happen that's outside of your control, but not so far outside of your control that nobody can control it, right? Like force majeure, we're dealing with wars and things like this. But I think the struggle today is the insurance industry is probably desperately grasping at all information they can to build some actuarial basis for their decisions. And this is a guess on my part, I don't do this for a living either, but I would guess that a lot of policies being sold as cyber policies or general business liability policies, that they're just putting a name on it because it's marketing.
What I've had told me from some insurance companies is that they're modeling off of the business continuity. Yeah. That's all they have right now until they amass some data. So you mentioned something about the savings account. So I have a question now. So should a company that's practicing diligence, should they keep some of that savings account in Bitcoin to pay the ransomware?
That's a whole other panel.
We need a new moderator, please.
So our cyber risk insurance provider keeps a stock of Bitcoins for us, and they'll pay if we ask them to. So we had this conversation. We have a high performance computing cluster. We can mine our own Bitcoins if we wanted to. But, well, A, I don't want to pay them, and B, our insurance company will take care of it. I don't want to go down and have an ATM card and pay to get some Bitcoins at a local shop or whatever. That yeah, I don't think that's a good use.
So if you're quantifying the risk and you get ransomware,
You'll always pay.
the risk is that you don't have Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. Hopefully you've got modern antivirus and backups and patching and other things.
I work for somebody who had a very different perspective on this some years ago, and he says that we need to consider the secondary and tertiary use of those ransoms, and they're often for really terrible things like human trafficking and things like that. So you have to decide as an organization, do we just do backups really well, or do we contribute in some small way to a global scourge of things like that? So and once he sort of framed it for me like that, again, that's sort of system 2 thoughtful thinking about a risk scenario. It changed the way I thought about that. I don't know. I think a lot of organizations are stuck and they have to pay or they go out of business. I think that's really terrible. I also think that funding the criminal underground is not a great place to go. So you have to consider all aspects of that for sure.
So one of the things I share in common with Texas is being from Maryland, and you might know that Baltimore City was subjected to ransomware, and the mayor, I guess ex officio, at that time, said that we don't pay terrorists, essentially, right? We're going to hold out. I don't remember the exact numbers in play, but I got to believe that it was somewhere in the $100,000 to $200,000 worth of ransom, and there was probably millions of dollars worth of losses. They couldn't process any payments to the city for over 30 days to shut down essential operations. There was quite a consequence. And the fundamental challenge isn't should I pay that small amount because it's cheaper than what I'm going to feel if I don't. It's if I pay that small amount, when's the next time they'll come back and hit me again because I've already proven that I'll pay? And how will they structure this like a business so that they get me just on the threshold of it's painful, but it's not crushing me, so I'll pay it again and again and again. And that's the challenge. And so the answer to this is having a defensive mechanism in place, and there are defensive mechanisms that are successful with ransomware, and a cadence of response that you can practice to where, if it happens, you will suffer some loss, but the loss will be significantly less if you can respond rapidly and reduce the overall impact of that engagement.
From the Bitcoin point of view, I would say from especially the financial institutions in New York or the New York Fed or Federal Reserve point of view, we're still trying to put the arms around, trying to put the regulations around. So unless if it is not an asset class within your book of business, I think it's
All right.
it's a further conversation, I guess.
So we'll close this panel with a trick question. So what's cheaper than Bitcoin? Backup. There you go. All right. Please help me thank the panel.